All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Cassie Hopkins, and I coordinate the webinars for Hausman Johnson Insurance. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Does Your Drug and Alcohol Policy Stack Up?, presented by Rick Barton. If you have a question during the webinar, please feel free to type it into the question feature, and Rick will address it. After the webinar is over, there will be a short survey we are hoping you can fill out for us to give us feedback on the webinar and webinar topics you're interested in learning more about. At the end of the webinar, we will also have SHRM and HRCI codes available if you need them for continuing education. This webinar will also be recorded and will be available on our webinar archive section of our website. Each attendee will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and the presentation slides. I would now like to introduce you to our moderator for today's webinar, Rick Barton. Rick has over 20 years of experience in safety and risk control, working with clients in many industries, including construction, mining, trucking, manufacturing, and hospitality. He specializes in assessing risk for the clients of Hausman Johnson Insurance to reduce loss potential. Through safety assessments and loss analysis, Rick develops solutions which include safety management techniques, training, and engineering. Additionally, he has been asked to speak at the local and national safety conferences on topics such as how to manage safety on a job site and what it takes to be a safety leader. Welcome, Rick.
Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you find what is today, the 16th or 15th of August. Hopefully everyone's having a good summer and enjoying their partaking of drugs and alcohol. So, but welcome. We're going to have about a 45-minute presentation just to give you a little heads up, and we will end up with some time for questions and answers afterwards. I do have a lot of information to cover in the 45 minutes, so I will probably go through some of the slides rather rapidly, but as Cassie said, they are available later on our website. So if you can't keep up or have to step out for a minute, you'll be able to catch up through our information on our website. So anyways, let's talk a little bit about your drug and alcohol program and whether or not it meets some of what I call best-in-class practices. So when I present, I usually talk about best-in-class and don't get too worried about regulations because we want to supersede those and be better than the regulations for many reasons. But what I thought I'd do is share with you some of the questions I get on a regular basis regarding drug and alcohol programs. And we'll talk a little bit about these as we go through the program, but I get these questions often. They're not necessarily in the order of most frequently asked, but they are ones I seem to get fairly frequently. The number one I get is, can I test under the OSHA regulations? OSHA made some changes years ago and said you couldn't do any drug or alcohol testing. Well, they have since rescinded on that a little bit, and there are some exceptions to it, but for the most part, we don't have any problem with that. Other questions I get are things like, can all of my employees follow the union testing, or you might say DOT testing, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the process. The other question I get a lot is, do I need to just test my safety-sensitive positions, or should I test all of management? And I'll talk a little bit about that in what I call a good safety or drug and alcohol program. Can I do just pre-placement testing and not do random testing, for cause testing, or post-accident testing? Do I need to do random testing? Well, we're going to answer that question. There are some states that you cannot do random testing, but for the most part, most states do allow it. Can I do field testing, either swab or other types of field testing where I don't use a clinic or I don't use urine? They are allowed. However, usually we want to talk to you a little bit about your protocols there and make sure you do some follow-up testing on those. And then what if an employee fails a test? That's always a big question. If someone fails a test, what do I need to do? Well, if you have a good policy and procedure, it should be answered there, and we shouldn't have to worry too much about it, but that question still arises. And many times it depends on when that test was done. And the last question I get quite often is, what if we find out days after an incident that someone was hurt or injured and we have a post-accident or employee testing policy? Can we test? Well, we'll talk a little bit about that also. So many of these questions I just touched on, and I will answer these as we go through the the program this morning. So with that said, I want to also talk about some of the other areas I want to discuss today, including why would you have a drug and alcohol program? I think many times we do it because we're told it's good practice, or we have to because of a legal reason, such as maybe I have a DOT driver and I have to have a program for those drivers. Or I might be working on a federal site which requires drug and alcohol testing, or I work on a construction site that requires me to have a program and I must follow my program or their more stringent program. So we'll talk about that. What needs to be in your drug and alcohol program will be discussed. What needs to be done in terms of implementation and ongoing. I think when I look at drug and alcohol programs, they tend to be dust collectors. They sit on a shelf. We only pull them out when we have an issue and we have to refer to them. But we should keep this program active and be reviewing it and making sure employees are aware of it. And then finally, what are some of the pitfalls? And I think that's really what a lot of questions that I receive center around. What are some of the pitfalls or mistakes that maybe others are making so that I don't make those? And that's what I want to discuss. So I'm going to have a few slides on just some of the major pitfalls in the drug and alcohol testing world. We also have the last, not so much the last issue, but another issue with the medical marijuana and CBD oils. I'll touch briefly on those. And in some cases, we may get into some legal territory that you may have to consult your legal counsel on. So I am not legal counsel. I'm only providing guidance and best practices here. I would advise everyone, as you put your drug and alcohol program together, you finalize it by having that final legal review of any drug and alcohol program. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about why. Why do we need a drug and alcohol program? Well, in the back of your mind, you're probably thinking, well, it's because I don't want to have people working on my site that might be under the influence of something that might have a negative impact on my site. And that might be a great reason, but there's many other reasons. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I think your number one reason is because your company has higher standards and you want to have a drug and alcohol program that does provide a safe and helpful work environment. This is very important that your company standards dictate whether or not you're going to have a drug and alcohol program. Another reason would be the safety of your employees. And many times we only have drug and alcohol programs for what we call safety-sensitive positions and or regulatory positions like our drivers and or other people on regulated jobs. But I think we need to think about that and consider whether or not even non-safety sensitive employees should be in that program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go through this. Drug and alcohol programs have been proven to improve your absenteeism. In other words, reduce absenteeism. It's been proven that individuals using drugs and alcohol, whether recreational or for other reasons, do have a higher level of absenteeism. So it's a good way to improve your production and get people to work. It also helps with productivity. If people aren't under the influence of something on the job site, they're going to be more productive in addition to being safer. The wellness of your employees also improves. There's been many studies on the wellness of employees and how a drug and alcohol program can actually increase their wellness. Another requirement might be you have to have one in order to get on a job site, and this comes up very often. So when you think about a drug and alcohol program, think about why you want to have one and make sure that you do have a good reason. And the last reason would be because it might be required by law. And I always refer to the DOT drug testing or if you're on a federal site that requires it. So there are some laws that do require that you have a drug and alcohol program. But I think if you go up to the top one, you'll realize that your company standards probably are going to be the number one trumping reason. So keep that in mind as we go through this process. Next, I want to talk a little bit about what needs to be in your drug program. There's 4 elements that you'll need. There are others, but these are the primary ones that I would recommend. First of all, what's your purpose? Why do you have a drug and alcohol program? Is it for the safety and health of your employees? Is it because you want to make your environment a very good place to work in terms of having less absenteeism and things like that. Do you have a policy statement? Do you have all your policies in order, and do they state what they need? And I'm going to go through what policies you need to have and what statements you need to have. You should have definitions on what are the limits at which you will test at. What will you be testing for, and how you'll be testing. So any words or statements that you have in your policy need to be defined in your definition section. And then fourth, the applicability. When, who, how, and where are we going to be using our drug and alcohol program? And again, I'm going to expand on each one of these in a little more detail. So these are the 4 areas that I recommend that are in every single drug policy, whether you are just starting out or maybe you have a drug policy you've adopted and maybe they're missing some of these elements. So think about that. So the purpose is pretty straightforward. Why do we have a drug program? Many companies basically state that it's for the wellness and health of their employees, and it's for the betterment of the individuals working in their facility or on their job sites. But let's talk a little bit about some of your policy provisions. Policy provisions are those that you might have in your policy that provide guidance on what you're going to have in your program. So, for example, who and when will you test? Are you going to include all employees, or are you only going to include employees that perform safety-sensitive jobs? So I might have an employee that is a receiving clerk. They might receive products, they might work on their computer 90% of the time, but occasionally they have to go out on the dock. Is that really a safety-sensitive position or not? Depends on their activities. But my thought process would be, why don't we just include them, because they are performing safety-sensitive jobs whenever they get near that dock area. And again, you can come up with many examples. That's just one that pops into the mind when I think about the policy provisions. Do you have any federal or state laws that you need to follow? And I think oftentimes we get into this DOT, I've got drivers that require testing, and so we decide, well, we're just going to follow DOT testing for all employees. I'm going to tell you and let you know right now, I think that every company that has drivers that fall under the DOT regulations, they need to follow by the letter of the law, the DOT policy. And for anyone else in your company that you may drug test, they really should have a separate policy and procedure. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. What else do we need in terms of policy provisions? What are we going to do for sample collection? Are we going to have certified collectors on site? Are we going to use a clinic? Are we going to use swab testing, which I highly do not recommend unless it's the last choice? But we need to think about who and where we're going to take our samples. There's many facilities around where you work that probably do the sample collection. And I realize some of us are in more remote areas. It becomes a little more difficult to get to these locations. But I think a good drug and alcohol program will deal with that on a regular basis. What else do we need? How about premise inspections? Are you going to be, let your employees know that you could do premise inspections if there are any for-cause situations. Some policies I've reviewed have no response to that. They don't have any provision for premise inspections. So if we do have to do a premise inspection, what is going to happen and how are we going to do it? I've had a couple scenarios where companies have called me and said they have a suspicion that employees have drugs on the premises, but within their policy they do not allow for a premise inspection, so therefore their hands are kind of tied. And in order to put that into the policy, they'd have to put it in the policy and re-educate all their employees. If you have that, you can do some premises inspections, and in fact, even work with some of your law enforcement allies that may come in with maybe some narcotic dogs and do some premises inspections with those. It works pretty nicely in many cases. Refusal to test. What are you going to do if someone refuses a test? And at the end of this presentation or later on in the presentation, I do have a statement on refusal to test. So you actually have some provisions on what to do. But do you have these policy provisions in your drug and alcohol program. A few others you need to think about: if you have an adulterated sample, what are you going to do? Are they going to be retested? Do they get a chance to retest, or is that going to be considered a positive? If it's going to be considered a positive, you need to make sure that is well spelled out in your drug and alcohol program. What happens if a person tests positive? Are they done, or do you have an employee assistance program? Some states do require an employee assistance program, and some states do not require that you have an employee assistance program. Some company policy provisions indicate that a positive test means the end of employment. So you need to make sure that you review this and make sure it is what your company feels is the best way to go. What else? Sample confidentiality. I think this is one that we often struggle with. People have in facilities, on job sites, wherever you may work, tend to have jaws that flap a little bit, and if we are doing any samples and it does come back, whether it's positive or negative, that is confidential. Only the person being sampled and very few people in the facility will know. The MRO officer will. We need to make sure they are confidential. It's just very difficult sometimes as people want to know, even though they don't have any reason to know. And then what are we going to do about off-premise use? If someone's using off-premise, is it allowed? Most policies allow it. However, with the advent of them coming to work under the influence of something, what are you going to do in the event that someone is using off-premise? Again, it's their time. They can do what they want, and they're going to have to deal with the consequences if they come to work and they do have amounts in their blood that are, or urine that are higher than the legal limits. Finally, training. Do you have policy provisions on who and when you are going to train? Many companies will train their employees once. They might make a policy provision that change and then they don't retrain. They might have supervisors, managers that might be used for witnessing or observing employees that might be under the influence of a drug or alcohol, and they don't do training on signs and symptoms. So make sure your training policies and provisions are very clear in your policy. So with that, I'd like to move on and talk about what other policy provisions you might need, including consent forms. These would be addendums to your policy. Training forms they're usually separate forms that you may use. Consent forms may be used at point of employment where an employee is going, or a potential employee is going to give you consent to do the drug and alcohol testing. It also gives you the proper consent to do drug and alcohol testing during their time of employment with you. Very important because it offers you the opportunity to discuss your policy with them and make sure they understand what they're getting themselves into in terms of drug and alcohol testing. As we know, in the pre-employment testing, many times we'll have an employee come in not aware that there's drug and alcohol testing, and they find out they have to do a test, and they're fine until you send them for a test and you never see them again. Happens many times because they know that they're probably going to test positive and they don't want to deal with the repercussions. But by using a consent form, at least you're educating them and discussing with them your policy and what it was covered under your policy. And then training forms. I think whenever you do any training, it's important that you document that. So and train all employees, supervisors, I could have thrown managers, owners, whatever you want under there. But anyone that's trained under your policy needs to be documented so we understand what type of training we provided with them. So with that, let's talk about implementation. You now decided you're going to have a program, or in many cases, I would assume many of you listening in today probably already have programs. And you might think, well, I'm doing a great job, and you're just listening in mainly to see what types of policy provisions you might need or what type of implementation program procedures you need. We're going to talk about some of those and deal with some of the issues that we deal with as we implement a drug and alcohol program. So every company is going to be a little different on how they implement it, but for the most part, if you don't have that top management commitment, you're probably going to fail. You might have a drug and alcohol program because you need to under certain federal regulations. But if you don't have management commitment that this is really what I need to do, it's probably going to fail. Management commitment would be under that policy statement where you are actually stating why you want that drug and alcohol program. But I don't think anyone listening in can have a very good drug and alcohol program if we don't have management commitment. And when I say that, that's coming from the top down, from the owner all the way down through your management team. That's very, very important. Then you need to develop a program specific for your company. Every company is going to have some slight differences in their policies and procedures. Many of you probably have a DOT drug and alcohol testing program. And that's great because you need one. You don't have any way around it. It's mandated by federal law. However, you may have many workers that are not covered under that program, but yet you might find that it might be beneficial for you to have one. So you make sure that your DOT program is separate from your non-DOT employees. Why? Well, it makes sense that you might have different policies in that provision that might be maybe even a little more stringent than the DOT policy, or maybe you want to exclude something that DOT requires. But I think they need to be separate because we are dealing with a different and a separate employee population. Then you need to inform. Once you develop your program, you need to inform and educate your employees. I think oftentimes we put a policy together, we hand it out, we have them sign off on it. That's great. Not sure that they all read it, but maybe you might assume they're reading it, and because you have their signature, you're good to go. And in many cases, you may be. But I think it's really important that if you're going to be committed to a drug and alcohol program, you spend that time and effort to educate your employees through a training session. And that should be on a regular basis. You may have a drug and alcohol program that you've had for several years and it hasn't been taken out and reintroduced to your employees. And I think it would be very important if you would reintroduce that to your employees and train them on a regular basis, just like you would any other safety standard. Any of you that might have a fall protection program or a lockout tagout program or whatever type of safety program, you have requirements to train on those every year, and that's a best practice. I would advise you to do this also with the implementation of your program. You train at the start of employment, and then every maybe year or every 3 years, you bring it out and you retrain employees that have been with you. I think it brings out the policy procedures that you have, the provisions you have, and any definitions that you may have that employees need to be re-educated on. And then finally, make sure that you train all managers, superintendents, supervisors, foremen, and other employees on how to recognize the signs and symptoms of use. If you have any for-cause, post-accident testing, you should have trained your managers on how to determine whether or not there has been use by your employees. And this should be on a regular basis. It's actually one of my main pitfalls is that we do not train on a regular basis. And therefore, I got a manager that he recognizes someone and thinks that they might be under the influence, but they're not really sure on all the signs and symptoms of maybe the use of cocaine or THC or any other drug that may be used in your workplace or used outside of your workplace and still in their system. So I think it's really important that we train managers, superintendents, and foremen at a little higher level because they're going to actually have to administer that program within your organization. So I think during the implementation stages, we train them separate of our employees. And then last, it's maybe not last, is we need to train on protocols. If you're going to be doing any in-house testing, you're going to need to have a certified tester. And therefore, we might have protocols that you need to follow, or not maybe, you will have protocols to follow. So we need to make sure that anyone doing any swab testing, any urine samples, taking urine samples, we need to make sure that they're familiar with the protocols. And that should all be part of your implementation process. And then we need to make sure that we use only certified people to collect those samples. So I think as you develop your drug and alcohol program, think about these, be honest to yourself and say, are we really training on the protocols we're supposed to be using for any testing that we may do? Some of us may be a little ways away from a clinic, so we do on-site sampling, and we do take urine tests and samples, and then we send them in for analysis. So we need to make sure we know what those protocols are. If you're doing a swab testing, many times there's instructions with the swab kits, and you need to follow those, but you need to make sure that your protocols are spelled out and your testers are following those. So then what do we need to do in our implementations? We have what we call ongoing things. We need to annually review our program so that we make sure it's current. Have we added in anything that maybe we want to add in, such as other drugs and alcohols? Typically, we follow the 5 panels that DOT uses, and then we also add in alcohol. But we may want to add other things. There are some companies that have up to 7 or 8 different types of drugs they're testing for. It just depends on their policies and procedures. And that's why you may have a separate policy for your regular employees versus your DOT employees, because you may want to add in some of those other drugs that we are well aware of and are out there and we can test for. You may need to update the program as necessary. And keep in mind, if you make any significant changes outside of maybe some grammatical changes, you would need to re-educate your employees and also retrain your employees and managers. And then the regular training. Now, regular to some people may be every 3 years, it may be every year. I think an annual drug and alcohol update would be well worth your time and effort. So this is kind of my ongoing training schedule that I look at. At hire, anytime someone's promoted for those managers, superintendents, and foremen, and anytime you change an employee status. So maybe you might have an employee that gets elevated from a foreman up to a superintendent. We now have more responsibilities, so we might want to retrain that employee. So I would recommend that you do training for recognition of signs and symptoms, at least on an annual basis. That would be best in class, and at a minimum every 3 years. And we're talking about a 2-hour training session about every year or every 3 years, depending on what level you want to be at. But best in class, I usually see yearly done. I have several clients doing it on a yearly basis for all those employees in those categories where they might be doing the recognition of signs and symptoms when they feel someone is under the influence of drug or alcohol. So those are some of the levels that we have to deal with. So let's talk about some pitfalls. There's quite a few of them, but I, over the years, have found that there are 4 of them that tend to be the ones that cause the biggest grief. And why do they cause the biggest grief? You may think, well, they're really not that big of an issue, but if you don't have these, typically you're going to probably end up having some type of a legal issue with your drug and alcohol testing, or you're not going to get the results that you expect. And keep in mind, some of the results you expect might be that lower absenteeism. It might be higher productivity. It might just be having a better workforce in terms of attitude. When employees know that the employees working around them are going to be safer and not under the influence, they might be a happier breed to work with also. So, what are those pitfalls? Talk about them a little bit. First one would be you're only doing it for compliance. If you're only doing it for compliance, you're probably getting the minimum use and benefit of your program. Yes, you're compliant because you can get on that job site that's a federal job site. Or yes, you can do it because I'm complying with DOT, but are you really doing it for that reason? Are you really doing it for the betterment of your workforce? I've been getting the big question nowadays is, Rick, do I really need to have a drug and alcohol program? I can't find workers that I'm not using. It seems like everyone that comes in for an application, once I tell them we have a drug and alcohol program, they either leave, or when we give them the paperwork and send them to the clinic to take their tests, they never show back up. I just have such a small workforce to deal with and a population that's available to hire. Maybe I'll just get rid of my drug and alcohol program to open it up to more employees and more potential candidates. Well, you're also opening up your company to what I would consider a more unsafe workplace, a less healthy workplace, and probably going to have some other issues. If you want to be best in class, you're going to do it not for compliance, but because it makes a difference within your workplace. And there's going to be a time, and it happens every cycle, that we're going to run into time where we're going to have an overabundance of workers that are applying for jobs, and it will make a difference. So keep that in mind as we go through this process. The next pitfall that I run into, and again, these are what I call Rick Barton's pitfalls. You may find them a little different, but I find these to be the questions I get all the time, is no policy. In other words, you want to do a drug and alcohol program, you put a little caption up there, I'm the president of the company, I feel that it's in the best interest of my employees, but my policy is either not available or I don't have any policy and I'm only doing it for compliance purposes. And therefore, you may not have a policy. So make sure you develop a policy. The next one is you don't have a policy for employees that they've seen. Many times I get asked to do safety and health evaluations. And sometimes the drug and alcohol program is something that we will take a look at. And one way I evaluate their program is I talk to employees and ask them if they know what the drug and alcohol program is. And sometimes I even get answers that say, I don't even know what the policy is because I've never seen it. My gut feeling tells me they've probably seen it, but it's been such a long time they're not sure what's in it. So again, if you don't review it with them every year or every 3 years, they're not going to understand what's in it. And again, by having them sign off on those sessions, you're going to have documentation to help you in the event that you have some legal issues. So make sure if you have a policy, the employees have seen it. And the fourth pitfall that I run into is that you don't include all employees. Most companies that I see where they exclude maybe office employees or what I call employees performing non-safety sensitive positions, we see a lot of animosity between those groups of employees. And my gut feeling is that if you're serious about your safety and health and you're serious about drug and alcohol program, everyone in the company will be in the drug and alcohol program. At any time, most of us end up doing something that could be considered safety sensitive, maybe not while we're an employee, but I just think it sets a better precedence. And I think those are the pitfalls where I see drug and alcohol programs that don't get their biggest bang for their buck. And I understand it's sometimes difficult to include those non-safety sensitive positions. Again, we're dealing with a small population to draw from when it deals with new employees with our full employment right now, but trust me, in the long run, you're going to be happier about your drug and alcohol program. So what are some other pitfalls? Let's talk about a few other pitfalls. Sometimes I don't run across this too often. In Wisconsin, we don't have this issue, but I know that Connecticut and a few other states do not allow random testing. Sometimes they have to review programs that are nationwide or they use them at all different sites. So make sure your program is state specific. So once in a while we run across that. Not a big issue, but something I run across. Sometimes I'm asking for documentation during one of those safety audits on training for a specific employee, and we can't find it. Well, if they haven't been trained on your drug and alcohol program, you know, if they test positive, they're probably going to find a lawyer, and they're probably going to find a way to get around your drug and alcohol program. So make sure you document all that training. Not testing all those involved in the incident. This is a big one. This goes back to the OSHA issue. OSHA allows testing. They allow it if the drugs and alcohol could have contributed to that incident. They also say that if I get injured, say I am an employee and I get injured, maybe an employee is using a piece of equipment and I get injured because of the use of that equipment, the employee that caused that incident or was involved in that incident should also be tested. And that's what I'm talking about here, is that all employees involved in that incident should be tested because they could have been potentially under the influence and that could have been a direct contributor to that incident happening. What else? Not having one person overseeing the entire program. I know we like to divide and conquer, but in this case, there should be a point person. Many people will know about it, but there should be a point person. Whether it's that HR person on your staff, whether that's a manager, whether that's a nurse, doesn't make any difference. Just make sure one person is overseeing the entire program. Not offering rehab in states that mandate it. There are some states that require that you offer an employee assistance program. Wisconsin is not one of those. However, there are about, I believe, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head. I believe there's about 5 to 7 states that do mandate it. If you need that, send me a question and I'll be more than happy to get those to you. I just don't remember exactly how many. Doing rapid testing. So you do your swab testing or rapid testing out in the field or at pre-employment, and you just accept that as a positive. You better confirm that with a urine test. You could use blood or hair, but I'm not recommending those. I recommend urine as your number one way of testing because it has the best results, and it's the best way to guarantee the proper testing. Not testing for all circumstances. Many pitfalls I run into is employers do not test for maybe post-accident, or maybe they're not going to include random testing. They do it because it's too costly. What does a drug and alcohol test cost? $50, $75. If you do, you pull 4 randoms once a month or 4 once a quarter, talking about $300, maybe $3,600 a month. That's not a very big expense for a company that may have a couple hundred employees, to know that their employees on a random basis, their employees know that they could be tested at any time. Some employers I deal with just test for pre-employment. Once they get in the door, go, let's have at it. They can do they can use all the drugs they want because we're not testing. So we need to have random post-accident testing, for-cause testing, and I see that to be a big pitfall. And then not training all your employees. Again, training is a big, big element of this program. What other pitfalls do we have to deal with? No training for managers on a reasonable suspicion. I have in parentheses every 3 years, best in class. I'd recommend every year. So keep that in mind. Not having a clinic to do the testing. I understand that some of you that are listening may not have a clinic within close proximity. You may do some initial swab testing, and you can do that as long as you then send that individual to a clinic to confirm that positive test. Not having a certified tester. Any one of you that are doing testing on site where you're either collecting a specimen or you are doing the swab testing, you should be a certified tester, either clinic or in-house. And by the way, the other thing is most clinics do have certified testers, but you should verify your clinic does have certified testers. Improper enforcement. What do I mean by that? You see someone that might be under the influence, you have for-cause testing, and you just hope that the next day they aren't under the influence. Someone comes in smelling of alcohol, they might be a high-level person in the company, and we ignore it. That's improper enforcement. Well, we're not going to test this person because they're critical to our operation, and we don't want to lose them. That improper enforcement is only going to come back to hurt you later when someone does test positive, and they know that person that they saw that was under the influence or could have been, and they weren't tested. So keep those things in mind, along with the chain of custody. I always think of the Ryan Braun situation where he was tested for performance-enhancing drugs, and he got out of it initially because the tester did not provide proper chain of custody documentation and did some things outside the protocol. So make sure your chain of custody is adequate. And again, the certified tester would understand those protocols and make sure they're done. I encourage many of my clients to not use in-house testing if at all possible. Use a clinic. Send them out to the clinic. I realize it can be a burden and a challenge, but now you're getting a certified tester unless you want to bring that in-house and you have a high enough population that you can handle that. And then testing. When can I test? If you're going to test for alcohol and you're going to test more than 8 hours after an incident, you're probably not going to get any positive results. So the recommendation is if you're going to test for alcohol from an incident, an accident, you would test within 8 hours of that accident. For drugs, up to 48 hours is what I recommend for testing. And then make sure that if you do any testing that you have a policy and procedure that allows an employee to be retested within a reasonable amount of time or do the follow-up testing to make sure that they aren't using going forward. So a couple other pitfalls. Again, not offering an EAP. I mentioned that earlier. I wouldn't get too worried about that. We don't have to offer one in the state of Wisconsin. However, I think a best-in-class program is going to offer that. I think it only makes sense. If your employees are valuable to you and you get an employee that they slip up once, they come to work and they were under the influence of something and it's a one-time shot and they're willing to go through an EAP program, it's probably going to make them a stronger employee. And then not offering it when it's required. There are some states that do require it, like I said earlier. Not using a medical review officer for interpretation of results. All of your results do need to be reviewed by a medical review officer. That's why if we do any swab testing, we're going to follow it up with a lab test, and we're going to use that test and have it reviewed by an MRO officer. Big one, not keeping our results confidential. Cassie, how are we doing on time?
Good. 45 minutes.
We're at 45 minutes?
41.
Oh, man. We got to speed her up, guys. Everyone, put on your seatbelts. We're going to go a little quicker here because I got a few more things I want to cover. I recommend urine testing. It's the most defensible test we have. It's been proven. I'm not saying you can't use blood or hair, but it is the most defensible. Don't worry about OSHA. I think if you have a situation where drugs and alcohol could have played a role in an incident, say a guy has a forklift accident, there's a potential. We really don't want you testing for ergonomic-related issues like carpal tunnel or things like that, maybe a bee sting because they're probably not related to alcohol and drug use. Again, I don't have a lot of time to get in details on this, but that's what we're talking about. And then having a policy and not following it. That's why we have a policy, so we follow it. If you have a good policy, this is a simple piece of cake to deal with because we follow our policy. There aren't a lot of unanswered questions. So a couple of last things I want to touch on, reasonable suspicion testing. A couple things I always recommend is that if you are going to do this, you make sure that if you do any reasonable suspicion testing, you let employees know up front you're going to do that. And then if you are going to it, you make sure that you have two individuals concur that the individual has signs and symptoms. Train your management at least 2 hours on suspicion signs, symptoms, and documentation. I would use a form to document any reasonable suspicion observations and be very specific when you document the reasonable suspicion actions. Keep the language concise and very specific to that situation and use that checklist to a T. Do not base any of your comments on prior incidents and don't exaggerate or use any type of anecdotes because they tend to get admitted into court and then we start making suggestions that really were not true and factual. So last couple of things. I mentioned earlier I was going to give you some policy verbiage. This is the one I like to use when we deal with refusal to test. We want to make sure that all employees are aware that their refusal to test includes these issues. I won't read it all due to lack of time, and make sure that they are aware of this policy. Last but not least, let's deal with this medical marijuana issue and also recreational marijuana and now CBD oil. I will tell you that right now it is still federally illegal. If you have it in your policy, I will not encourage you to take it out. However, make sure it is what you want in your policy. Medical marijuana in some states, obviously, as we know, is very acceptable, but there are many things you have to go through in order to make sure that medical marijuana is used, and most employees have to be certified to use it. So have a policy and state what your policy will be on medical marijuana. I just had a case recently where someone called me and said, hey, Rick, I got an employee that tested positive for THC. They said they were using CBD oil. Guess what? If they tested positive for THC at the levels that are required to test positive at, they probably weren't using just CBD oil, but if that's what they want to say, that's fine. We are finding CBD oil with higher levels of THC in it than what we had expected. The good stuff, though, is typically very, very minor and probably very small amounts. So if you got questions on this, please send me a question offline. I didn't really have a lot of time to talk about this, but What I want you to understand is that a good program is going to be top management down. It's going to have a good policy provision. It's going to state the consequences, and it's going to have employees are going to understand it because they're going to be trained along with managers, supervisors, and foremen. So with that, I'd like to finish up with any questions that you may have. If you do, send them through, and I'll try to answer them in the next couple of minutes.
All right, so it's time for questions. So you can put those in the question or the chat feature, and it looks like we already have some going through. So the first question we have is, do you think companies should have Narcan available like they did with an AED?
That's a good question. That's a great question because that's kind of still up in the air. I've talked to some employers that feel they should. But, I'm going to leave that up to the professionals, the police officers to do that. I would probably, at this point, shy away from it a little bit with the understanding that we probably should have caught that person earlier in the stages, and he might have had recognizable effects of the illegal drug use.
All right. And just for my own knowledge, what do those acronyms mean? AED and Narcan.
Narcan is a device that is used to someone that is overcome by meth, or not meth. Now it doesn't come to my name, but basically it's like an EpiPen where they'll provide a dose of Narcan, and it will counteract anyone that goes unconscious from the illegal use of several narcotics. And then AED is an external defibrillator, so an automatic external defibrillator that most employers should have because they're great when anyone does have a heart attack or goes into cardiac arrest.
Very good to know. So our next question is, when is a DOT D&A policy required?
Whenever you have an employee that is driving in commerce and driving a vehicle that is over 26,001 pounds.
Any other questions? Leave it open for a couple seconds just in case. And all right. So here are the HRCI credits and SHRM credits if you need them. We want to thank you guys so much for joining us. And remember to please fill out that short survey, as your feedback is very important to us. We really hope you can join us for our next webinar next month, and it is going to be on mental stress claims and workers' compensation by Peg Kramer, and that's going to be September 19th. And you can sign up for our upcoming webinars on our Hausman Johnson website. I want to thank you guys so much for attending, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.